rocking the health world with the healing power of radio. Here is the voice of health, freedom, and liberty, Robert Scott Bell.
Yes, there's no place like home on the Robert Scott Bell radio show, back from 2 weeks of adventures out in the field, rocking the health world wherever we go. Today, we're going to go and rock it even more, because I've got who I call the rock star of retrovirology going to be joining us sometime this hour. And that means we're going to tackle one of the most egregious violations of scientific integrity, that I call the paradigm of HIV equals AIDS. I got to do it. It's very important. If science is ever going to come back from the political realm and the economic-only realm to a genuine, let's say, questioning of what is out there, what can we get explanations for, without bias, without corruptions or conflicts of interest, this is a very important hour, a very important show today, with my honored guest, a dear man, and I welcome you back to the program, Professor Peter Duesberg.
Hello, Robert Scott. It's likewise. I'm glad to be back here again.
Yes, and by the way, I've gotten an email already before you've come on the program here, and it's a letter for you. It says, "Dear Peter, I just want to let you know publicly how much you have done for me and my family. We lived in fear and paranoia for a long time until we talked to you, and for the first time since," this is what she's writing, "my husband found out he was so-called HIV positive. Somebody talked to us like we were human beings when they were scared and confused." And basically, she said she regained her perspective on life as her husband did. And she says, "I hope one day, Peter, I can give you the most amazing hug." And, how do I introduce this concept except to say that you called into question the science behind the HIV causation hypothesis, and maybe you can bring my new listeners that have never heard from you before, Peter, up to what you uncovered early on.
What I have been expert in, so to speak, was viruses as in general, and viruses possibly causing cancer, and that was in the 60s and 70s. I studied those. This is what I came to study from Germany to Berkeley in California, where there was this great virus laboratory heading for cancer viruses. Wendell Stanley was the director. Harry Rubin was one of my tutors there. So we checked this and found out, well, under certain conditions in little animals, these viruses can occasionally do something before they get immune competent. But as a cause of cancer, viruses turned out to be a dead-end road. For one very primitive reason that most of you already know, cancers are not contagious. If they were caused by viruses, they would be contagious. If I had a lung cancer from a virus and would be even close to you, not to mention even having any intimate relationships, the chances would be by huffing and coughing, just like you get flu from me, you would get cancer from me, or colon cancer from toilet seat and all these business. And that isn't so. So many of us who had made a good reputation, a good living from these viruses as causes of cancer, realized in the 70s and early 80s that this is not going to pan out. We have to do something else with our brains and our institutions and our laboratories to justify our existence, or justify it by continuing insisting on something that doesn't work out. So people were looking for things like new diseases, and here came AIDS. And many of my friends jumped on that and said, look, these viruses, these so-called retroviruses we studied as causes of cancer, why couldn't they cause AIDS? It's a new disease, and these viruses were newly discovered by us. So that makes a lot of sense. Let's continue to do virology and do that.
Peter,
and here were the problems.
Yes,
Yep.
Peter, I need to set the stage because we have to go to break here. And we're going to come back and set this historical perspective and the science underlying it so we can really move forward with an understanding of what I believe, and you have, I believe, also have proven as well. We're going to talk about that, what the science says about what this immune deficiency is, and also what to do about it. All right, by the way, as we continue with Professor Duesberg from UC Berkeley this hour, I want to let you know his website because I have lots of links to the things that he's doing and other information on this topic of immune deficiency, the genuine science behind it, and the corruption of science that has sent us in a spiraling and a devastatingly deadly direction somehow altering our belief systems to say that immune destruction is really the fault of a deficiency of chemotherapeutic agents, whether it be AZT or other drug cocktails, which is horrendous and nonsense. But we've got to deal with this head on. Duesberg.com is the website. There's a very interesting thing that I think can consolidate a lot of this for you. At Duesberg, DUESBERG.com, there's a multi-billion-dollar quiz. And it's the question, is AIDS a viral or a chemical epidemic? And I'll reference that as we move through the interview. But as I said, Peter was setting the stage regarding originally the discussion or the investigation to whether viruses cause cancer. And I think, Peter, that's very interesting because we've been hearing so much about the human papilloma virus that Merck has brought out this shot because they're saying that will prevent cervical cancer.
Yeah, that's another outcause of this idea that viruses would cause cancer that didn't pay off. So now they're coming and say, okay, we have developed methods that find needles in a haystack. It's called the polymerase chain reaction. You heard about that?
Yes, PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and was it Mullis that got the Nobel Prize for developing that?
Exactly. Our friend Kerry Mullis got the Nobel Prize for that, inventing it here in Berkeley. And he's actually a good friend of us. He's on the same side. He's also questioning HIV as a cause of AIDS. Anyway, with that method, you can find in the cervical cancer little fragments, I should say really fossils of a past infection that women and men get in their teens or early 20s when they first have sex. That's when it's a sexually transmitted virus causing genital warts. It's relatively common, but it's harmless. I mean, basically harmless. It causes the warts. It's a nuisance. Yes, it may hurt a while, and then it resolves itself like all warts.
Peter, I've read that 90% of the women with HPV clear it of their own accord with no interference from any drugs, medicines, or doctors.
I think it's closer to 100 because these viruses and the women have been around for millions of years and had the same viruses, and so did the men, and they have all survived it.
That wouldn't do well for Merck HPV shot sales, though.
So, but if they can, and now they find fragments of it. They pick it up at 20, but when do women or men or anybody gets cancer? Almost all of them are over 50. It's a disease of old age. 95% of all cancers are affecting people over 50. So they get their cervical cancer in their 50s, 60s, and 70s like everybody else. That is, like every other woman with or without the virus. But when they find, it's the same trick as with AIDS, when they find with these machines a little piece of viral DNA, which is, as we would say here in Oakland, doing nothing anymore because it's fragmented, it's not a complete virus anymore. It's just a leftover piece of DNA from a cell that was, or precursor of a cell that was infected 30 years or 40 years earlier. Then they say, the virus has caused it by some mysterious mechanism that takes 30 to 50 years to cause that disease. You recognize the scheme. It's the same idea by which they say, you get infected with HIV today. The virus is long gone. All you find is antibodies against it or a fragment of DNA or RNA with the polymerase chain reaction. And guess what you get 10 or 20 years later? Now you get AIDS. And what is that? 26 diseases. It's the same old trick. So we develop a vaccine and we give you drugs. And here we are selling a vaccine. Yeah. Even if this vaccine were the smashing success they say it's going to be, even if this were true, guess how soon we would be sure that this is the case? We couldn't even know until at the earliest 30 to 50 years from now.
Well, that's after Merck has made a few $100 billion, 50 billion, 20 billion.
I would say quite a few dollars they would have made for every vaccine. It's I guess it's $100 to $200 these days. That's at least what it is. And there are millions of girls that could be vaccinated, probably someday boys too.
Yes.
Equal rights. And we would know in 30 or 40 years, all of the guys who have claimed it are no longer available to testify. They probably moved to Switzerland in their cottages and have changed their names. Are long forgotten.
Yeah. Well, we got to go to another break, Peter. Listen, one of the questions I want to ask Peter when we come back is, prior to AIDS, was there a viewpoint in the scientific circles that he traveled in? Was it a point of fact that when somebody had an antibody to any given microbe, that it meant that they were going to die or meant that they were going to get sick, versus what I thought was a common perception in immunology is if you had an antibody, it meant that you had successfully been challenged and overcame it. We're going to touch that issue and many more with Professor Peter Duesberg. We're talking about the true cause of immune deficiency in AIDS. Is there any precedent in history that you know of one man being right and the rest of the world being wrong? Of course, there are numerous experiences like that throughout history, whether it be Copernicus, Galileo, and all of those. And here we have a modern-day issue dealing with something called AIDS and the fact that the global consensus, the scientific consensus, it's not everybody, but you got the consensus. They got the bucks. They got the power, supposedly, saying that a retrovirus, never been caught in the act of doing anything, as far as I know, is the cause of a devastating immune condition, and they changed the definition of what that is depending on where you are and how they test for it or don't even test for it. Of course, we're talking about HIV and AIDS, and I've got, I'd like to consider a dear friend. We've had him on the radio a number of times. Can't wait eventually to meet him in person. Peter Duesberg, professor from UC Berkeley, who's withstood tremendous attacks from the consensus community, if you will, where science I didn't know was all about belief, but suddenly it became that. And as we were going to break, I was going to ask Peter, I'm going to reiterate this again for everybody to understand. Throughout the history of at least modern virology, immunology, there was a thought or a proof that said if you had an antibody to any given microbe, it meant that you had come encountered it and successfully, if you're still alive, overcome it. And then suddenly at the dawn of AIDS, that all changed and it turned everything upside down. And suddenly now, if you have an antibody, it meant you were going to die. And they've extrapolated that into this H5N1 bird flu nonsense, which we may get into as well. But I want to ask Peter, is there any precedent prior to AIDS when an antibody meant devastation and death versus what I thought was a positive immune response?
No, certainly never in viruses. In bacteria, sometimes such tests were done, but the Wassermann test on syphilis. But in the general principle is vaccination artificially induced by attenuated viruses or bacteria, or naturally, of course, that's biology, that's billions of years old, is the only defense against viruses, are antibodies. And once they're there, the show for the virus is over. There are virtually no exceptions. That's why we are all encouraged to get polio vaccines and flu vaccines and God knows what, and smallpox and chickenpox vaccines, because once we are vaccinated, or yellow fever, whatever have you, we are protected against these diseases by our antibodies. Viruses, when they're tacked onto antibodies, cannot get into cells anymore. It's over. There is nothing that can happen anymore. And all immunologists that I know of in science, and all virologists agreed on that ever since Edward Jenner invented the concept. Guess when? 200 years ago in England. 1793, Edward Jenner invented for 60 pounds the principle of vaccination. You're taking a pox virus from cows and injecting them into people where it's not really pathogenic but related enough to induce an immune response that protects against the human virus.
Well, staying out of the Peter.
Yeah.
Staying out of the controversy of vaccination, because there's a lot of issues there that I want to spend.
I just explained the principle now, not necessarily a controversy.
True.
I'm just saying,
True.
The principle is when there's antibody against it, artificially or otherwise induced, that essentially stops the virus from getting into cells and ends the infection. There could be side effects and God knows what, but when the antibody is there, the show for the virus is over. There's no exception to this, and all MDs and PhDs and immunologists and virologists say, okay, when you have antibodies against all viruses we know of,
yes,
you are protected except one, They say exactly the opposite, and that's HIV.
Yeah, now there is a trial going on in Australia. I think a man that they claim infected others or threatened to infect others even inadvertently, who was considered HIV positive based on the so-called tests out there. And recently, Robert Gallo, the supposed co-discoverer with Luc Montagnier, went on the record there and admitted that I think he only found HIV in about 40% of the samples there originally, and he himself admitted that that was not enough to prove causation.
Yeah, I heard that testimony. Is that trial closed now, or has it?
No, it's still ongoing. We're trying to keep an eye on it because as soon as it breaks, I mean, that could the judiciary in let's say Australia could be more scientific than the scientific community at NIH and those under Bob Gallo and those that have followed through him like Anthony Fauci and others that seem to still follow the politics and the money rather than the integrity of finding out what the truth is.
Yeah, I mean, this is. Do you think they will lock him up? What's your take on it at this point? Yeah.
Well, I mean, based on what I've seen of the judges' responses, it looks like there's a chance that they could rule in favor of this man, that he cannot be considered transmitting a deadly virus when there's not even a test that can confirm its actual presence. We're going to come back with Peter Duesberg after this break. All right, I should have my links on my site back up this afternoon or tomorrow at rsbell.com, but you can go to Duesberg.com, Duesberg.com. Also, there's the $1 billion question. He's got it on for download, free download, as a PDF and as a PowerPoint presentation. He gave this at a Lou Rockwell seminar in the Bay Area over there a while back. Peter Duesberg is my guest. And why does this matter to you? Why does this matter to every American, not just the small percentage that have this so-called immune deficiency? Well, I don't know if you recalled on this show, if you're a new listener, you hadn't heard this, but the CDC proposed last year that it was going to begin or was going to attempt to promote this idea of universal HIV tests. In other words, everybody, for any time you go into the doc's office, you're going to get an HIV test. Now, that if you're not in the so-called risk group, which is growing smaller by the day, you've got to recognize and realize that every HIV test that I've seen that has been approved by FDA has a disclaimer in the insert that says this test, I'm paraphrasing here, cannot be used to diagnose the presence or absence of HIV, much less the disease called AIDS. Now, how would you like to get a test and then get a positive test on something that can't even test for what they're claiming you're positive for? Peter, I mean, this has got to be an embarrassment for the scientific community to ever degrade this far.
Yeah, it should be, yeah. But we'll hope it comes out that way. Let's see what happens, yeah. That would be great, yeah. Now, see, the test is totally indirect anyway from the very beginning, as we just covered. It is an antibody test in most cases. You look at an antibody against a virus instead of the virus that might possibly be your enemy. The antibody is your defense department. That's your own defense department. How can that be an enemy? That's what the body uses to defend against microbes and viruses. That is not an enemy. That is a complete, literally a perversion of the fact.
Well, isn't it true, Peter, that in most infectious, or I say all infectious disease, they could actually culture the microbe to prove that it was there present and causing a problem versus just trying to use PCR to extract or magnify somehow strands of DNA?
What you're saying is called, in the business, we have to meet Koch's postulate. Robert Koch was the man, actually he was a German guy, a long time ago, 100 years ago, who discovered the first microbe as a cause of disease, or proved the first time that the microbe was the cause of disease, tuberculosis bacillus. And he got a Nobel Prize for it. And that concept was so popular that there were hundreds and hundreds of people imitating it and said, I found the microbe of breast cancer and I found the microbe of tennis elbows. And he said, wait a minute, in order to prove a microbe the cause of disease, you have to meet 3 conditions.
Hold on, we got to go to break on this, Peter, and it's in your PowerPoint and PDF download at Duesberg.com in case we don't get to it next segment. All right, following up this hour, here we are with Professor Peter Duesberg from UC Berkeley. And, why, again, is this important to all Americans? Billions with a B of dollars have been spent and just reauthorized in a different direction from whatever war they had. War on cancer, war on poverty, war on. You want to declare war on something, you get more of it typically. And in this case, war on AIDS resulted in what? A massive attack against the retrovirus that nobody seems to be able to find doing anything. And the only way to diagnose it is to detect through amplification antibodies that are nonspecific and cross-reactive. And one of the ways to be sure to cross-react and have a false positive, so-called, is being pregnant, for one, among many things. If you ever get a chance to read the insert of any HIV test, you'll see how insane the paradigm is that would allow people to be sentenced to death for a so-called antibody test that may not even be detecting what they say they're detecting. Now, I'm trying to put this in lay perspective because, as I said, there's a PowerPoint and a PDF of the presentation that Dr. Duesberg gave at a Lou Rockwell seminar in the Bay Area a few months ago. And it's available for download at Duesberg.com. Also, I'll have it up. I'll have the link at rsbell.com later today. But we have a scenario where, this is your money. Taxpayer money is being taken, I say stolen from you and used in this way, or being sent to Africa where they don't even have to take a test to be called HIV positive or have AIDS. And Peter's, all he's been doing is like this voice in the wilderness just saying, hey, look at the science. There are questions here that you're not answering, you're ignoring, and I got some speculative stuff here. If you look, and it looks pretty good, pretty solid. And I've seen what Peter has written, absolutely agree. And that's why we have him on the show today, help clear up some of this confusion from the scientific realm. Again, Peter, honored to have you with me.
Very likewise, Robert. I'm really pleased to be on the, Bell Show once more. It's always very refreshing, and we can ask real scientific questions.
Well, and we're not afraid to ask the questions that bring uncomfortable answers sometimes, because I think the truth is more important than some political expediency or pharmaceutical sale. I mean, call me crazy, but I believe that.
You're one of a kind.
Well, here, this isn't really a scientific question, Peter, but it's an email, and I figure we, honor somebody that would take the time to write you. This is from Mary. And she writes a question for Peter Duesberg. I was wondering what I could do on a small level to help get the word out that there is something very wrong with the HIV equals AIDS theory. Also, what do you think is stopping the media from talking about this and it being a big story? Because it certainly needs to be. Thank you for answering my question. That's from Mary. Mary, thanks for the email. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, what could you do? That's, of course, you could send me $1 million. That would be the first step. And serious, I mean, if you know somebody who's a millionaire and who could help, that would help. But you could write a letter to a newspaper, or you could speak up at the Robert Bell show. That would help. Any of those things that generate some publicity, or write to a magazine. Magazines sometimes are more sympathetic, particularly if they don't know the name yet. And the reason why are the newspapers essentially closing the doors or essentially censoring any dissent is that, like the scientists, they have become very dependent on the government, particularly the science writers, and on the scientists who are experts in the field to give them the latest breakthroughs in the news. And we have breakthroughs on AIDS for 25 years now, except we have never cured one and we don't have a vaccine, and the drugs we prescribe are chemotherapies that are inevitably fatal. So that's what we have. But see, the news writers, like my colleagues in science, if they want to make a career, if they want to get a merit increase at the university, they have to show papers. And if they want to show papers or produce papers, they need a research grant, and they need students, and they need to publish. So if they write one paper, as I have done, like 15, 18 years ago, romantically or naive as I was, or still to some degree, saying this doesn't add up. Guess what? I've never had a graduate student since. Never. At the University of California in Berkeley, which admires itself for its freedom of speech and all that, those days are over. I have never had a graduate student since. I never got a research grant again. I was in the Academy and still am in the Academy of Sciences. I had every grant I wanted for 25 years. Ever since I have written more grants than I've ever written before, over 21 or 22 grants applications, asking for support on cancer research and initially on AIDS. Not one of them has been funded. I'm not invited to the conferences anymore. I'm not even invited to the Christmas parties of my colleagues anymore.
And Peter, let me be clear here, because this is all because you dared to question the consensus that HIV causes AIDS.
Yes, and see, and for them to be too close to me would look like almost like to be too close to a Jew in Germany, the country where I came from in the 1930s.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because those on that consensus side are calling people like us who just question the paradigm and say, let's look at the science. Yep. They call us denialist, and we deny nothing. We try to provide the truth and not deny anything. In fact, we know immune deficiency exists. We just question the fact whether it's a retrovirus or not, or we're pretty certain it's not.
And see, denialist is not even in the dictionary. It's sort of a religious term. I mean, yes. They try to shift it into a territory where it's a character, an autonomous problem, or an emotional thing, an irrational thing. But in reality, this is a scientific question.
Yes,
is the virus causing it or not?
Correct.
What are we doing to give 100,000 fellow Americans who have antibody against the virus DNA chain terminators to kill a virus that is already dead and neutralized?
Right. Peter, don't go away. We're up against the hard break here. By the way, Duesberg.com, also some of the greatest sites on the web to rethink this whole thing include barnesworld.blogs.com. It's known as You Bet Your Life. BARNES world.blogs.com. I've got links to that at rsbell.com.